Marketing gave my talk a really long title. Personally, I just like to call this Intro to Game Localization 101. This is sort of like a general things you should know, high-level design pointers, and some recommendations for using our tools effectively. So who am I? Why am I giving this talk? I'm Giovanni Catini. I go by Context Lost on Roblox. I've been at Roblox for 2 years. I'm a senior engineer on the physics team, actually, but I do a lot of localization as well. I was one of the key engineers who working on the localization service, localization table, APIs, designing and implementing that. So I've done a lot of localization before Roblox as well. At the last 2 companies I was at, I helped ship 4 different games and localize them afterwards. So I did a lot of the work on the localization systems and tools there. These were mostly social and mobile games, which should hopefully be really relatable to you guys. And today I really want to try to share everything I've picked up while I was doing that and share it with you guys so you guys can help localize faster and localize better. So 2018, it's the year Roblox is going international for real. We've already got and released our client localization tools earlier this year, and we've got first rate across the platform for Spanish, and recently added in the last couple days, French, German, and Brazilian Portuguese, with more coming soon. So this talk is about localization. So first of all, what is localization? It is adapting your game for play in a different language, a different culture, and a different community. It's way more than just translation. A lot of people miss that. So key takeaways from this talk, high-level things that you should take away. So the first is that localization is easy, to start at least. On the technical end, I think localizing in Roblox is easier than any other platform, any other engine I've worked with in the past. I'm biased, but I think we got really great tools for this. The second thing is that localization is hard. This might seem like a contradiction, but if you've ever heard of the 90-90 rule, it's sort of like half joke in programming that the first 90% of the work accounts for 90% of your time, and the second 90% accounts for the other 90% of your time. You see that it's actually 180%, that's a joke, but localization is one of those things. Your first pass localization will pretty much be a weekend project, but getting it right can take a lot more effort. So it is worth starting. Why should you localize your game? All right, here's the really big reason. Approximately 20% of the world's population speaks English, and this is really on the optimistic end. This is including non-native speakers. If you're looking at native speakers, that's around more like 5%-ish. So if you're not localizing, that's most of the world who can't really understand your game. This is why I think localization is kind of a really noble endeavor. It's almost, you can see it as an accessibility feature, really one of the biggest there is. If you want to share your ideas with most of the world, really, you need to localize. Yep, stuck. Okay, of course, there's a lot of potential for growth. Doing it well isn't always cheap or easy, but if you do it well, it can really pay off. More localized content is going to mean more growth, more players, and revenue per user differs per region, but generally more players per profit, more profit. And like I said before, it's really easy to get started. So let's start with the good news. It's Roblox. We've got lots of cool tools. How easy is it? Let me show you. So I'm going to do this quick any % speed run to show off how fast I can localize jailbreak. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start the text scraper here. I'm going to start the game, play solo. I'm going to run around. I'm going to click through various UIs. Text scraper is scraping up all the text. It's showing up in the data model. And that's good enough for demo purposes, so I'm going to go ahead and stop. And I'm going to export the localization table that generated. And for this, I will switch over to Google Sheets, import that. And I will use the Google Translate, Google Sheets macro, to get a rough and dirty first pass translation of all these strings, en to es, Espanol. Drag on down. And I got some really rough first-pass translations here. So I'm going to fix a couple places where Google Translate kind of like mangled some parameter tokens here before I go over and import. Otherwise, I'm going to get an error. So one more here. I'm going to export that back to CSV and switch back to Studio. Load that CSV back into my localization table, hit the test Spanish button, hit play, and jailbreak in Spanish. And that is a minute and a half there. I can actually do it faster. I can get this under a minute, but I can't really talk that fast. If that was too fast for you, I've got a nicer 5-minute walkthrough video that you can check out later. If you download the slides, I've got a link for that. So that gives you an idea of that first 90%. So let's dig in that other 90%. What I just showed was minimal effort, really low quality localization. There's a lot of things that I was ignoring there that could really make this not successful. So what issues might we run into? First is that language is weird. Humans are strange, we're inconsistent, we often fight about silly things and pretty much never agree on one right way to do things. So humans, we're the ones who invented human language, and so surprise, different languages are different in how they work, and for every rule, there's always exceptions. If you only know like maybe 1, maybe 2 languages, then you probably have a lot of implicit assumptions about language and how it works, and a lot of those might come to bite you when you're designing UI. So knowing a little about language can help you avoid some of these pitfalls and save you a lot of time that you might have to spend redesigning UIs later. So I just call this stuff language trivia, so I'm going to devote some time to going through some common issues. So one complicated subject is gender. And I'm not just talking about gender identity, I mean as like a grammatical concept. We're lucky in English. English does not have grammatical gender. But grammatical gender is intrinsic in many languages, almost like most Latin and Cyrillic-based languages besides like English probably have gender as a language concept. That includes languages like Spanish, German, Russian, Portuguese. Most of the languages you're looking at translating now, you'll have to deal with this. And that means every noun has a gender, even the inanimate ones. This rock has preferred pronouns. Rocks are feminine. Get it right. My hands are feminine, but that's okay, because so are all of yours. But my fists are masculine. I don't know why, that's just how it is. So the place that this will come into play and come to bite you is in conjugation. This is something that you don't have to deal with in English. In many languages, your verbs, your adjectives, your prepositions, your determiners, all of that, you're going to have to choose the correct form of those words based on the tense, the plurality of the target, and sometimes the gender of the target. So I will demonstrate. So in English, there's basically 2, 3 forms of the verb demonstrate, ignoring the present participle demonstrating here. For future tense, we use modal verbs like will and shall. Now, the Spanish word for to demonstrate is demonstrar. And if I want to use it in a sentence, I need to consult this table. Now, that is 30 different forms of the verb for demonstrating. Suddenly, I care who is doing the demonstrating. And there's a few extra tenses in there, too. Did I get interrupted? Was that maybe not a for sure thing? Now I care. So I can't just switch words out of sentences as easily as I can in English anymore, because sometimes you just have to rewrite the whole thing. So when might this bite you? Consider something like a classic kill feed. We've all seen a lot of games in Roblox especially who do this. This is the easy first way to do things like this. Like things like you just dump it in the chat as a system message. You hit context loss with a sword. Would reviewer hit Golly Greg with a hatchet? Great. So if I want to translate this right, I just do blank hit blank with a blank. I let the localization system match parameters, and I'm done, right? Super easy. No, this is terrible. Don't do this, please. So where this might bite you is like you hit is a different conjugation case for the verb hit than he, she, random username. And you're going to have other conjugation headaches around the verb as well. Also, the gender of the weapon comes into play. It's una espada. The sword is feminine, but it's un hacha. The hatchet happens to be masculine. suddenly you care. So an easier way to do this, it's just more typical classic kill feed, just consistently use usernames and use icons for the weapon instead. You see, this looks exactly like games like TF2, Counter-Strike, Overwatch. You've all seen this. And now you know why the companies like Valve and Blizzard are doing things this way. Because when it comes time to localize, it saves you effort. It's more work up front, saves you time later. So another tricky subject is plurals. In English, we really just have two forms. We have the singular form and the plural form. And in games, really, oftentimes you can get away with just using one form or the other, like 20-or. In other languages, this isn't always the case. It doesn't generalize. You'll encounter tricky things like languages that have noun forms for duals, special cases for two of something, or pockle forms. This is a little more rare. Some languages have had it and dropped it. Some still have it. And even some cases like Russian, they have 3 different forms. There's a singular form, and there's 2 different types of plural forms depending on the last digit of the quantity. If the quantity ends in 2, 3, or 4, that's a different form of plural. So when might this affect your game? You have a pop-up or a chat message that says, hey, you got 200 gold coins. So this is good, right? Not really. In Russian, that is potentially 3 different forms of gold, 3 different forms of coins that might be depending on the quantity. So an easy alternative, just use an icon. Hey, you got some stuff. And then there's an icon, and there's a quantity. That I have ever encountered, at least, icons do not have plural forms that you have to worry about. And honestly, in comparison, I think the top one's kind of underwhelming. Pictures are more fun. So an easy one is number formatting. Different digit separators, different decimal points, different digit grouping rules. You actually see in the Indian numbering system, it's actually like groups of 3, then it's groups of 2, and then it's groups of 3 again. It's not consistently grouped in even groups of 3 even. At least for this one, there's a nice, easy solution. Just use our localization system's format strings for this. Let us worry about getting all the rules right for all the locales. Another basic consideration is text length. People like to folk phone it German for this, especially. So here's a classic example. OK, let's all try to say this together. Come on, let's do it. Let's pronounce it. Haps. OK, I can't really pronounce this. I'm sorry. So big surprise. This actually shortens down to, motor vehicle liability insurance. OK, not much of a surprise. This one's actually that long. Italian, also a classic on the length. What is visualizzazione? It's views. Yeah, that's a lot of extra syllables. So this is a table from IBM's globalization guidelines, and what this tells us is exactly what we just saw in the last slide. Long things expand less than short things. So for long things, you might need to allow for an extra 30, 50% space. For shorter things, they might end up being 2 or 3 times longer. A common reason for this is abbreviations, where you might have an easy abbreviation in English. There might not be a good abbreviation available in all languages. So a quick overview of our design for localization tips is avoid parameters in a sentence where possible. If this is absolutely essential, you're going to have to do a lot more research. So just avoid it where you can. Where possible, it's easiest to just use alternatives like icons or tabular data, just like table-like presentations like our icon quantity. Use our localization system's format strings for numbers, and always make sure you leave enough room for overflow. So one thing that's often overlooked is that localization isn't just purely technical. It's not all mechanical, and it takes some creativity too. One reason that machine translation kind of stinks for games is the technology isn't perfect, but even if it was, what you're going to get is a very little translation with no external context. And very often, a perfect little translation is often the wrong translation. Common reason for this, besides homonyms, is like humor. Memes don't always translate. It often relies on a lot of subtle cultural context that isn't always there in another language. Common one is like cultural references. You'll have to get creative with that. And for slang, ideally your translators are culturally savvy in both languages, which is a tricky thing to find. Also idioms, figures of speech. It's raining cats and dogs. That's going to translate into hilarious gibberish. In that case, you're going to need to add some translator's notes, like say a figure of speech for it is raining very hard. You're going to need to explain that to people. You're going to need to make your intent clear. So really, if you want your translations to turn out well, this really requires two-way communication. You can't just treat translation like a purely mechanical, transactional effort. So a really good example of this, I think, is the 2018 Egg Hunt. It was one of the first big games, not the first. I think Mining Simulator might have been the first top page game that was localized to Spanish with our system. But with the 2018 Egg Hunt, they had some really good creative localization. So the loading screen had these 42 egg-related puns. And a lot of them were wordplay and puns, which don't always translate well. So for this one, in the original English, we hunt eggs all week long. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, fried egg. That almost works. Haha. So you see the Spanish here, if we translate that back to English, we can see we look for eggs all week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, eggs, and Friday. So the reason for this is the translator got creative and he replaced Thursday instead, because Thursday, huevos, sounds more like eggs, huevos. So this is actually a much better pun in Spanish than it was in the original English. A computer can't pull off stunts like this for you. So here's another one. We hope you're having an excellent day. That's just beyond saving. Translator replaced that with a totally different original joke. This stuff is not going to happen if you don't have open communication with your translation team, because they are probably not going to rewrite content for your game without your permission. So we just spent a lot of time on language, but to call back to an earlier slide, localization is way more than just translation. Each of the slides here could easily be the topic of its own presentation, but we're short on time, and I'm an engineer, not a global marketing guru. So these are mostly topics for further study. But I do think they are important enough that they are worth mentioning. So one is that you really need to remember you're adapting for a totally different culture, totally different context. This is a different society with different tastes, different values, different priorities, different media exposure. You think about, like, what are you playing? It's probably heavily dependent on what are your friends playing. And that is going to change a lot from region to region. So all this means is you could potentially have very different preferences in gameplay and art. A really good example of a company going the extra mile to tailor to this is the League of Legends character card art. If you remember LoL, most popular game in the world, like 2 years ago. You probably know if you play, but their character art is completely different for China and the North American region. Let's see, the North American art is usually on average a little simpler, usually a little warmer colors, a little softer, but not always. It's actually the same art department that does both, but they're doing this in an attempt to tailor to the cultural preferences of each region. I'm not exactly sure how much of a difference this makes, but League of Legends is one of the more rare examples of an American-made game really taking off in China. So it can take a lot more than just translation to really ensure success. So you also have to think about, how do you support your community? How are you building an audience now? Are you using like Twitter, YouTubers, giveaways and codes? How you interact with fans? How are your users reporting issues? You need to think about, how are you going to support your foreign community? How are you going to do all these things differently for your foreign users? They need support too. So that covers game localization in general. So I do want to spend a little time at RDC here to talk about these tools that we have and how you can use them effectively. So earlier I showed off the localization service automatic translation system. It's pretty cool. It's got a lot of advantages. It's really easy to get started with, especially with an existing game. Supporting translating a game with no changes to the game itself. You just add localization tables and everything magically translates. And in the future, we're going to add like automatically scraping text and generating tables for you and have a cloud-based system for managing translations. And that's all really great. It does have some downsides though. This isn't a 100% solution by design. It can't translate every possible UI that you come up with. If you're doing any kind of text animation, like a typewriter effect where text is scrolling in, we can't translate that. We can't translate incomplete text. You're going to have to write some scripts to patch that up. So also managing translations by their source string is kind of brittle. If you change your source code or you change your text in the data model, you're going to get those translations that source and your text mismatching, and it's not going to translate anymore. This is really hard to keep consistent. It's kind of the reason the system really exists is it's also sort of the last resort for unmaintained games, which is a case that we do want to support. We want to be able to localize unmaintained games. But if you are actively developing a game, that system isn't one size fits all. It can't be. And when you outgrow that, or it just can't do everything you need, we got all kinds of APIs that can give you more control. What we kind of do expect is for people to treat our system kind of like a foundation sort of framework to build more on top, their own customized tools and modules on top of it. So personal recommendations, if you're getting started with a new game, these are just some tips on how I think you should do things. So first of all is don't put any text in source code or really anywhere in the data model. Try to only use keys. It's like the first place your text should go is in a localization table. Even if you're not localizing right now, you're going to do it later, this will save you a lot of effort if just all your text is already in tables. So also put a little thought into how you organize your tables too. You might not have a whole ton of them, but you might have more than one. You might have one table for all your general stuff and then one table for all your dialogue. This can make things a little easier with another thing that I'm going to mention. So also think about where you're going to put them. If you're using them with the automatic text matching system, you do need to put them in localization service. But if you're not, or you're using localization table references, you might not put them there. You might put them in replicated storage or replicated first, depending on what kind of GUIs are using them. So also just advice, just own your own workflow, take ownership, take responsibility for everything working, and write your own little localization module around on top of ours. This is going to be just a real thin little module, just writing some custom utilities, things for format quantity or format some dialogue. Little helper functions that are going to make things easier in the rest of your scripts. Also, probably write your own little localization plugin. It's easy as writing game scripts, maybe just a single button that's just update dialogue table, because you know where all your dialogue is stored in the data model. We don't. We can't make those assumptions, but you can. If you can do that, that's going to save you a lot of time over using the text scraper to get everything. Also, simple thing, just disable auto-localize on your GUIs if you're not using the automatic system for that GUI. If you're already handling that all from scripts, disable auto-localize, saves the automatic translation system a lot of work. And always localize on the client. Don't localize on the server. If you can avoid it, it makes things a lot harder. You have to make sure you're doing it for the correct user. Just don't send localized text over a remote event. Send information about the event and let the client take it from there in local scripts. So I don't have time for code samples today because it's just a 25-minute talk. But a lot of what I would have wanted to cover is on our dev portal already. I helped write a lot of these docs. Hopefully they're useful. You can download the slides later and check all these out. So thanks for coming. I think we've got some times for questions. And if I don't get to yours, feel free to tag me on the dev forums, or you can find me on Twitter, or if you come up with some questions later. Thank you.
So when localizing numbers, are there languages where there are other character sets and stuff that we really need to worry about? Or
Yes, but we aren't there yet. Okay. And when we get there, we will support that in the number formatting system.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that it for now? Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, go for it.
Could you, in theory, use localization tables to support Roman numerals?
Yeah, I'm not sure how you would do that. Yeah, we don't have a nice system for that right now. Okay, cool. Well, if you come up with any other questions later, you guys know where to find me. I'll be here all day.
Thanks for attending these guys. We're going to have snacks downstairs, and then we're going to resume with panels in the ballroom. So see you guys all downstairs.